Hello, UK Crime Book Club. I am so excited. I'm here with Kia Abdullah, and we're going to be talking about those people next door, which I've just spotted. He's right behind you. So, do you want to introduce yourself and show off the cover and tell us a bit about the book?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me, Sam. And
Thank
and
you for
hello,
agreeing.
everyone. Thank you for joining us on this blustery evening. So I'm Kia Abdullah. For those of you who don't know, I write kind of courtroom dramas. I always say they're a cross between kind of John Grisham and Jodi Picoult, because while they do take place in the courtroom, they kind of often have family dramas woven in as well. So that's certainly true of Those People Next Door, which is out tomorrow. In this one, we meet Salma, who is a teacher who has just moved with her family to a safe suburban development in the outer reaches of London. Soon after arriving, she gets an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. And there she meets her next door neighbor, Tom, who's a bit of an alpha male. He's friendly enough, but the next day, Salma sees him uprooting the Black Lives Matter banner that's in her plant pot. And initially, she chooses not to say anything to him. Her family are new there, and she just doesn't want to cause a fuss. So she takes the banner inside and quietly puts it in her window instead. But the next morning, she wakes up to find her window smeared with paint. And this time, she does confront Tom, and he reacts with hostility, and things begin to escalate. And it becomes clear that somebody is going to get hurt.
Things begin to escalate. It's a bit of an understatement. It does happen slowly, though. You do weave that in, this kind of growing sense of dread and this, and Salma really questioning herself, and Bilal, her husband,
Mm.
questioning, is this really what's happening? Are we being a bit paranoid? Are we being a bit oversensitive? And kind of taking a step back and wondering whether to approach Tom and Willa, Tom's wife, or whether to just leave it. And Salma's more, she's more wants to go and confront it. You don't let bullies win. We don't let this get out of hand. And Bilal is a little bit more laid back with it, a little bit more reserved, wants to take his time and really think about it. And I really liked how that was just kind of dotted, threaded through really well. And you kind of, Tom and Will aren't the most likable people, are they? They can put on a good front, but they're not. They're
Yeah.
not the most likable people. Quite rightly so. Um,
No,
there's
I mean,
so
it
much
was
to
really,
discuss with it.
yeah, it was really important to me to be authentic, so my novels very much take place in the real world. There's no even with the twists, I try to root them in reality and make them feasible. And so in terms
Yeah,
of the kind of slow creep dread, that was very much on purpose, because you can imagine living next door to somebody and igniting hostilities. You just want to get along, because we can all imagine living next door to kind of nightmare neighbors. And I come back to an example where I used to live before, and my next door neighbor used to put his bin in front of ours on bin day. And it was such a minor, trivial thing, but it just, got my goat. But even that, I wasn't prepared to say to him, oh, by the way, can you leave your bin in front of your door? And neither did I have the kind of passive aggressiveness to just push it back. So for three years, we just lived with this guy leaving his bin in front of our door. And so I kind of wanted to draw on that dread that we would all feel if our neighbors were like that. But in terms of, what you said about Bill and Salma, again, I know people who take a very zero tolerance approach to kind of microaggressions, or if someone said something that might be construed as clumsy or could be construed as offensive, they would take the kind of really hard line and say, you should absolutely not say anything like that to me. And then there are other people who just say, you know what, I don't want to spend my life angry, and let's try to get along. And it's only when things come to a head that Bill also realizes that he needs to kind of stand up shoulder to shoulder with Salman.
I think I'm more of the kind of person who would lie in bed 3 years later thinking of something that I could have said. Something will finally come to me when it's far too late and the other person's probably forgotten that I exist. That's probably when I would have a response. I don't know about you. How
Yeah,
much?
but would you, but the thing is, would you still say anything, even when you have got the perfect response? I mean, that's such a British thing, isn't it? To want to say something, but holding back and just kind of simmering in bed 3 years later.
I think I probably would not. I don't know. I'm more likely to say
Okay.
something now, but it would depend what it is. I'm
Okay.
far more likely to just not even pick up on things at this point. The Sam of 10 years ago was quite a different woman. So I think I'm
Yeah,
more likely to
you
not be
learn to
bothered
let
by
things
things.
go, I think, as you get older, but I
Yeah.
don't know whether that's right or wrong.
I suppose it depends what it is. So some things are just not worth the argument, but I suppose it's spotting, actually I need to nip that in the bud. That's problematic.
Mm,
And not just something that irks you, but you just know it's a thing that bothers you. Whereas what's happening with Salma, clearly not a her problem. It's clearly not just something small that's bothering her that wouldn't bother anybody else. It's something
mm,
that really needs tackling just kind of straight away. I can understand her hesitance to do it initially, just to see, because one of the first scenes, and it struck me because of a conversation between Salma and Bill. Um, Salma's getting a taxi back from the shop with the shopping, and she's bent down. There's a can's rolled under the car. It's fallen out of the bag, and she's bent down to pick it up. And a neighbour, Tom, is stood just kind of tossing a ball between his hands or bouncing it. He's playing with a tennis ball in his hands, and he looks up and down
mm,
the street and then throws the ball directly at it's the Black Lives Matter flag that's in a little plant pot in a garden. And Bill says to her, well, maybe that's just, the child inside him. We're a bit petulant. We want to just knock things over. And it makes her question her instinct of that's not what his behaviour was showing. To look
mm.
up and down the street and be furtive about it just shows a different level of intention.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about these sorts of situations, isn't it? You can never be sure. And so, one thing I say about those people next door is, it's it's a thriller about nightmare neighbors at core, but the kind of layer beneath is exploring racial tension in modern Britain. But how can you be sure that tension between neighbors is indeed racial? How can you be sure it's not just two families not getting along? And that's something we face in reality. When someone treats me badly, sometimes you might question, is it because I'm a woman of color, or is it just because that person was having a bad day? And I know people who take both attitudes, and some people, especially on Twitter, you see them, they spend their lives angry, and other people probably let too much go, as Bill does to start off with, because they do just want to get along. And so
Mm.
I wanted to explore those nuances of the gray area. When do you assign blame, and when do you say, as Bill said, it's just the child in him. He was just aiming for it. It could have said, white lives matter, all lives matter. It could have been anything. He would have done the same thing because he was just being a bit of a boy and playing with this ball.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of us probably most of the time fall somewhere in the grey area of not speaking out and then maybe wishing we had, or speaking out and wishing we hadn't, and then thinking, well, actually, was I a bit over the top there? So
Yeah, I mean,
we,
it's the grey areas that really interest me, And another example I use was a couple of years ago. I was on a cruise, just so happened to end up on this kind of luxury cruise with loads of rich Americans, and I was in the library working on my novel on a laptop behind a desk, and this older American couple came in and they said to me, "Oh, do you know where the steak restaurant is?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, I don't know." And they said, "Oh, do you know what time it opens?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not sure." And then they said, "Oh, what else is around here?" And again, I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I can't help you." And they looked at me really flummoxed and said, "Are you a volunteer?" And I said, "No, I'm a passenger." And they were mortified because they had assumed that I was staff. And there are people who, would have felt really angry at that they had just assumed that I was staff, presumably because I'm brown. But I thought, well, I'm also behind the desk. I'm also younger, about 10 to 20 years younger than everybody else on there. And, I gave them the benefit of the doubt, and we ended up having a half an hour conversation, and it was really fun, and I got to know them. But it's really tricky because you know, in this day and age, I think maybe I would have approached that slightly differently, just because of the way that people are on Twitter, and they do feel a bit hypersensitive to me. And that's quite a controversial thing to say sometimes, I think, because you know, people would listen to me and say, "Oh, you're an apologist for racists," you know, and I'm like, "Well, I don't think they were racist. I think they just made a clumsy mistake." And so, yeah, exploring those grey areas is a really kind of interesting area for me.
It is, because it can be seen from either point of view. And there are scenes later on in the book. I'm not going to talk about exactly what the scene is, but there was
Mm,
a scene where we see Salma preparing for something, and she's kind of working her body language in a certain way and holding herself in a certain way,
mm,
and looking at Tom, who is the neighbour, and thinking, I bet he never has to do this. And the page
mm,
before, we've seen him literally doing the same thing. So there are those things that there are a lot of similarities in how we assume other people may be confident, or maybe, you know, assume certain things, because we all do, whether we mean to have,
mm.
you know, a judgment of somebody or not. It's kind of, it's there in the background somewhere. It might not be a mean judgment, it could be a really lovely judgment, but we all do it, and we all assume that other people are confident or are able to portray
Mm.
themselves in ways that we might want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you say about, you know, we're all guilty of it. I can give you an example. So I have a friend who, you know, comes from a middle class background. Her dad's an accountant and she's black. And when I met her, I assumed that she was working class. And she said, oh, later on in a conversation, she said, oh, because I'm black, people assume that I'm working class. And I thought, I've actually made that same mistake. You know, was I being racist? Well, it was connected to the color of her skin, but I wouldn't call myself a racist, and I don't think I was being racist. But some people would construe that as being so, and so we all make judgments. And you know what you said about Tom, it was important for me to also show Tom and Willa and the ways in which they see the world from their perspective. You know, they think Salma's being oversensitive, and some of the things that she chooses to do, for example, I mean, I'm not giving anything away by saying she shares what Tom is doing on social media, and there's a bit of a backlash
Yeah, that's
against him, and
quite
there's
a,
consequences.
so, yeah.
Yeah, and so, you know, I wanted to show how the decisions we, any of us, make have real life impacts on people, and show the kind of human side of Tom as well, you know, when he's preparing for what he's preparing for. And so, you know, and their sons are also friends, and that's like another aspect of the novel where the younger generation often don't think about kind of divisions as much as the older
Yeah.
generation do. And so that's like another thread that runs through the novel.
I did make a note, and I'm not sure where I put it, about the friendship between Zayn and Jamie. Um, and I'm really annoyed with myself because it'll come back to me at some point. I've got so
Okay.
many different questions and things. So let's talk a little bit about Zayn and Jamie. So they are a similar age. They are the sons of the neighbours, and they get along fantastically well. When they first meet, they are in their bedrooms at the top of the house, looking over their balconies at each other, and just absolutely hit it off. I mean, straight from the off, their conversation is as though they've known each other for years, you know, as though they've grown up together. But in reality, these two teenage boys have just met. And it was a really interesting way to look at it, because teenagers are often bravado, a bit bolshy when they first meet, sizing each other up a little bit. And there just wasn't any of that. Inwardly, they were maybe thinking these things, but outwardly, they were both trying to just be themselves and not let all this other stuff from the world. I mean, the parents are getting on at this point. They're not really aware of anything at this point. They just met.
Mm.
And it was really interesting to see these two young men forming this really nice relationship.
Yeah, I wanted there to be tenderness between them, because I think that's something you very rarely see. And you learn a little bit about Zayn's backstory. So Zayn is Salma's son, you know, he's the Asian boy. And they've moved from a rougher area where he got in trouble and he was kicked out of college. And a lot of the problems came from putting on an act, being a certain way in front of his friends. And there's an anecdote he tells about one of his friends who managed to get a decent job, and how he would just get ribbed by all his friends about, wearing his little suit and going off to his job. And in the end, he gets himself fired because he's just doesn't feel, he feels too different from where he came from. And so I wanted Zayn to have learnt from that mistake. And
Yeah.
he feels a little bit like an older brother to Jamie, who's a little bit younger. He's got a bit of a speech impediment, and that, I think, it kind of endears him to Zayn. And they strike up a friendship. Mainly because they're working on an app together, and they have grand plans, and then obviously life gets in the way when their parents come, get into conflict.
It was really interesting to see the boy who went off and got a job, and then he's going out in his I think you described it as kind of a brown. It was almost like a little. It wasn't a brand new suit. It was a bit rough around the
No.
edges, and he was really making something of himself, and he just couldn't tear himself away from being this boy on the estate, and that's who he went back to, and that was a really interesting way to look at it, and it was a really nice thing for Zayn to, as you say, you used that to show that's something he's going to learn from. He's not going to make that mistake. They've moved away a short distance, but it might as well be worlds apart. And you've used that as a really good thing for underpinning Zayn's opportunity that he's got now. We've moved away, I'm starting again, let's see
Mm.
what I can do with my life.
Yeah, because one of the things about growing up somewhere like that is that one small decision can alter the course of your life. He gets kicked out of college, and suddenly his entire life, it's moving nowhere. And there's a scene where he talks about his parents getting up and going to work, and even that just feels like an indictment on him,
Yeah.
because he's just lying in bed doing nothing, going nowhere. And so I wanted to kind of show that contrast, that they've moved to this area, this really safe suburban area. It's, very brand new. There's lots of brick, there's lots of space. They've got a massive garden, he's got a big bedroom. But sometimes you can't get away from the life chances that you may or may not have. And so, like I said, life gets in the way. And so when his parents clash with Tom and Willa, they get involved, and they kind of not ruin, but impact his friendship with Jamie.
I've just found the line. It was the line that when they're making the forming this bond, and you used the line "friendship that hasn't been tested yet," which I thought was
Mm,
very. You have this knack with details that you add so much depth with just a sprinkling of words. I just think you've
oh, thank
it's
you.
I just you know what a big fan I am of yours anyway. So this is when you read things and you sit back and you really think about the scene and you think about the effort that has gone into that word choice. You just select in a few words and it just brings this whole relationship alive. Is this
Thank
something that
you.
keeps you
Thank
awake
you.
at 3 in the morning thinking about word choices?
I mean, I definitely spend a lot of time on the words. And I remember, I mean, that's partly why I've slowed down, actually. And so, some authors can do both. They can write beautifully, and they can do a book a year. So I've done 4 books in 4 years, but this one nearly killed me. It's in the middle of the pandemic. I just had no inspiration. And normally I'm very much a plotter, and I thought, let's do it in the way of the greats, let's do it the way Ian Rankin and Lisa Jewell do it. Let's not plan too much. And then I just found myself in the doldrums in the middle, thinking, I don't know where I'm going with this. And so I'm actually slowing down. So I'm going to do one every other year. And that's partly because, I do spend a long time like getting the words right, getting the characters right, and drawing out their backstory. And I think sometimes genre fiction, especially crime, can be seen as, this disposable form of fiction, airport
Mm.
fiction. You read it and you throw it away. But what we're seeing is crime fiction that really matters. When you look at the work that someone like S.A. Cosby is doing, or, Abe Mukherjee, who engages with empire, Simon Meir, talking about a woman in the north, making her way in a conservative Muslim community. These are big themes, that are being engaged with in crime fiction. So, literary fiction often looks down on the lowbrow fiction, but actually, I think it's such an effective way to kind of engage with social commentary, but bring readers with you, readers that may not be reading, the Booker Prize novel, whatever it may be. And so, I think there's a really important place for crime fiction.
Absolutely, and it just, you must feel exactly the same that I do, the same as any author, any reader. Crime fiction is not the correlation. Crime fiction delves deeply. We have complex characters, complex storylines, plots, things that take us in directions we would never expect. But as you said, with a realism to them, this is something that you could literally move house, and this could be the situation you find yourself in. And
Yeah, and
it's
also it makes you look at the world differently. So Graham Bartlett, he has a book out, Force of Hate, and I read it. It's out in March, and it made me think of people who don't have a fixed address. Homeless people in a different way. I grew up in London, and so homelessness was just very much a fact of life. These people become invisible. But I read his novel, and it changed the way that I engage with the world, and so it really can change the way you think and the way you perceive your daily life as well. And so, yeah, it definitely has a kind of uh, a deeper. I mean, I don't want to say mission because that's quite a highfalutin word, but a deeper purpose, let's say.
I think a deeper mission, a deeper purpose is absolutely accurate. I think we learn so much from it, and books that introduce you to people that you maybe haven't met before, from different backgrounds, from different classes, from different educations. There's so many different things that if we all stay just where we live and only get to know the people around us, absolutely fine. Millions, billions of people probably do that. But it's by going out into the world and getting to know people and having conversations that you really find out who you are. And it shows you that the person that you think you are isn't necessarily who you are. It depends on how you're reacting to situations. For example, after the pandemic, so many authors have gone and done book launches, and they think they'll be either really excited or they think they'll be really nervous and they think they won't know what to say. But actually, when you go out into the world and you're with other readers, there is so much in common, there is so much to talk about. I've gone to numerous events on my own now, and I'm never alone at a book event. And there's just every walk of life is in there discussing books with you, and you learn so much from the experience.
And that's what's especially nice about the crime reading community, actually, because I think, and the crime writing community. I mean, I can't
Mm,
remember who said this to me, but they said, well, crime readers are so, they read so much and they read so broadly and
yeah,
widely that crime writers don't have to compete with each other because, it's not a case of, are you going to read, Abir Mukherjee or S.A. Cosby? You're going to read Abir Mukherjee and S.A. Cosby. And that's why
yeah,
there's just this real strong sense of community and camaraderie among the writers and the readers, which is really nice.
yeah. And people get so excited to meet each other in person after all this online, and we met. And in fact, I'm going to mention a panel that you did. So I've seen quite a few different panels now, and we were in London, and you hosted
Mm,
a panel at Capital Crime, and
that's
the
right.
whole weekend was fantastic. It was wonderful. But I've told many, many people that your hosting for me was the one that really stood out. So I don't know if I've
Oh,
told you that, but I've told
in a good
everybody
way,
else.
I hope.
Yeah, it was fantastic because you have such
Oh,
an
thank you.
interest in other authors' processes and their lives, and how their world is impacted, how their world within the pages is impacted by them as a person and by their lives, but also by the lives of the people that they've met. So you just dug so deeply into things. And I just remember looking around and thinking, people are leaning forward, people are leaning
No,
forward to pay attention.
thank you.
And I just thought you were wonderful. So is that terrifying? You didn't look terrified. You always looked really confident.
Thank you. No, I mean, I enjoy it. I'm a chatterbox. So let's get that straight. Firstly, I'm one of 8 children. And so I grew up, around noise and color and, you had to shout to be heard. And so I really
Yeah.
actually enjoy being in, there are some writers, and I totally understand, they like writing, they're writers, they don't like to be in public spaces, they get nervous. But I love all that. I love going to festivals. I love meeting readers and writers. Give me a microphone, I'll gab away for an hour. And so, no, I really enjoyed that. The only thing that was wrong with that was the weather. So I don't know how many of your kind of viewers at the moment went to it, but I mean, there were gale force winds, but we coped. We coped.
I was I was the hardy northerner walking around with a cardigan on without even a coat, wondering what everyone was complaining about. Everybody else was in scarves and hats and bundling up and making little, I don't know, maybe some of it was a bit of fronting it out as well. I'm a northerner, I can't be walking around looking like I'm cold. I did at one point put a jumper on over my cardigan. That was
Okay.
really pushing it for me.
I just remember there was an outdoor bar, and I thought, I think it was Graham Bartlett and I were just shivering, and he was like, "I'm getting old. I feel the cold." I said, "I've always felt the cold. Let's just go." And that's where we met you. We had a drink, didn't we, at the hotel, which was
We
really
did, and
cool.
you had your photo taken with S.A. Cosby and with Winnie Lee.
That's
So
right.
it
That's
was, yeah,
right.
that
Yeah.
was a lovely evening. Um, and I was not starstruck at all the whole weekend. We've got so many comments, so many hellos. I've just looked and we're already halfway through, and I've not even touched on anybody else's questions yet. So, oh, Kaz has asked, and hello to everyone who's said hello. Is there a place you've travelled to that you'd like to set a novel? So one of the things that I noticed in this was Salma saying that there were places that she'd wanted to visit from being 11. Um, Antarctica, Easter Island, somewhere in Canada. I forget the name of it now. There
Baffin
were four
Island.
places.
Yeah.
Thank you. So have you got places that you want to visit?
Oh, I do, yeah. I mean, I'm also a travel writer for those who don't
Yeah, of
know. So
course.
I have traveled pretty widely. I've been to about 70 countries and all seven continents. I haven't been to Canada yet, actually, which is one of the big ones on my bucket list. So I definitely want to go there. In terms of setting a novel somewhere, I mean, I love East London. I grew up here, I was born here. I think it's such a rich area for fiction, just because
Yeah.
there's rich and poor here. There are different races, it's a place of constant change. You had the Huguenots, you had the Jewish community, you had the Bengali community. Now you've got Eastern Europeans here.
Yeah.
And in one way, we all live in harmony, and in another way, we don't. And so I probably will continue to set my novels here. In terms of if I ever tried like another genre, horror, or maybe even wrote under a pen name, I think I'd
Mm.
love to set one either in Antarctica or like the deep north. So this last year, 2022, I went to Svalbard, and it's
Oh,
called the last stop before the North Pole. And we got to within 9 degrees of the North Pole, and it was just such a desolate, empty place. And there are no trees there. When people die, they have to be sent to mainland Norway because of the permafrost pushes the corpses up. And I thought, wow, that's just like prime for a crime novel. An old corpse has been pushed up through the permafrost, and who killed them? And so there are always ideas going, percolating in the back of my head. And I always say, if you're a writer, the most important thing is, well, apart from reading, is to just be out in the world, because you never know where ideas are going to come from. You never know when two different ideas are going to merge together to create the perfect plot. And so for me, traveling widely is just a part of my creative process.
I was talking to Victoria Dowd this morning, and we were talking about how I never, for a while, I haven't been out of the house much, and lately I'm out all the time, and it's really sparking things with me about just hearing people speak, just people that you don't know having a conversation, and you try to be subtle, in paying attention to what's going on.
Mm.
But it made me realise how much I've been stifled by sitting at home and not being out in the world, and what a difference that makes. So somewhere like London, where you're walking around and it's busy, there's hustle and bustle, there's old and new buildings, there's all different kinds of things going on. I can understand how that can be, constantly something firing in you.
Yeah, and I'm, naturally curious. And I remember having dinner. This was after the pandemic, when things were beginning to lift, and there was a family of four, you know, like a middle-aged guy, very average looking, average height. He had graying hair, and his jacket said, I don't think it said born to be wild. I think it said like born to rebel or something. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Is he wearing it ironically because he just looks so average, or is he, does he really believe he's a rebel? And so even small things like that,
Mm.
I will cherry pick. And full disclosure, the story that I said in Truth Be Told, where Zayn's friend goes to he's got a nice office job and he's getting on well. That's an anecdote that Trevor Noah,
Oh yeah,
the writer and the comedian, told
yeah.
about his friend. And I thought that's so interesting, because I know men like this, I know boys like this, I grew up with them. As soon as you're studious, you do well in school, you're seen as a boffin and all those kind of pejoratives that make you feel bad about yourself because you're the smart one, or because you're the one that's going to do well. And that just resonated. And so I think, reading widely, being out in the world, listening to anecdotes, cherry picking things, that's the way kind of creativity happens for me.
Yeah, and I can see now what's been missing when I've been staying at home so much, and so many of us, not just because of the pandemic. There's so many reasons for people staying at home, and we miss so much, which is why I love doing these events. It's one of the reasons that we said we would carry on doing the online interviews. I know lots of people have scaled them back for very good reason. The world
Mm.
opened up and people didn't necessarily have the time to, or the energy or the family time to devote to doing this kind of thing. And I know how helpful it was for me, for my mental health during the pandemic, to be able to talk about books
Mm.
and with health issues, not being able to get out as much, being able to have conversations. My husband jokes with me that it's almost like I'm able to go speed dating, but obviously I've been married for 2 decades. I'm not going to go dating, but being able to talk to new people all the time. I'm a chatterbox, like you said you are. And it doesn't make me any less nervous talking to people. It makes me more nervous probably because I never know what's going to come out of my mouth. But actually, this has
That's the
been the
best way,
most
though.
helpful thing. Yeah, sometimes it is, and sometimes I think, oh, stop talking. But you've really embraced it, just going to different places, talking to different people, being on different panels, hosting panels. I mean, you are really flourishing and thriving, enjoying every minute of it, it seems.
Thank you. Do you know what it is, Sam? Some of you will know this already, but I moved to the north. I moved to Yorkshire, a small town called Richmond, in 2018, and I was there for 3 years, and I was there during the pandemic. And I just missed London so much. I mean, all my family are here, most of my friends are here also. And I think we moved back in February this year after 3.5 years there. And I just threw myself back into London life. We've been to the theatre, we've been to parties, we've been to literary events, book events, and I just say yes. So that's the first thing, first reason, because I mean, it got to a point where if I was down in London seeing family and there was a film we wanted to watch, we would say, oh, no, no, let's save it for up there so we have something to do in the evenings. So it's just a very quiet life. So in a way, it's the antidote to that. But also, I just, again, like I just think it's the way to. It's so key to my creativity, just being out there and meeting people and chatting away. And so I think also I realized how much I didn't take advantage of being in London. We say, oh, it's got amazing restaurants, but I would always go to the same restaurants. I can remember the last time I went to the theatre, but this year,
Yeah.
well, last year, 2022, we made the effort. We went to the theatre 3 or 4 times. And so I think it's just, I'm energized by being around people. But, the other thing is creative processes are different, aren't they? And some people aren't energized by that. They're drained by that. But for me, the other reason I say yes to a lot of stuff is, it's a boring marketing term, top of funnel. And sometimes, when you're really busy, especially in pub week, you get asked
Mm.
to do podcasts which are just starting out, and you think, I'm probably not going to make any book sales from this. But for me, A, I love to gab, but B, you don't know who's listening. You don't know who, like, it could be the sister of a Netflix executive who then decides to pick up those people next door, and then I think
Oh,
that's what
it would
happened
be
with Killing
great on
Eve.
Netflix, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. But I think that's what happened with Killing Eve. I think the wife of a TV executive was reading the Killing Eve novel, and all she did was walk across a floor and introduce it to somebody else, and that was, you know, the spark that gave us Killing Eve. And so for me, I just feel like, you know, nothing is too small, because like I said, A, I just love talking to people, but B, you don't know where that's going to lead. You know, it's top of funnel. So, you know, in 2 or 3 years' time, it might bring you something. And a classic example of this is I met a guy called Faraz, I think like 10 or 15 years ago at this networking thing. And during the pandemic, I think at the end of 2020, he got in touch with me and said, "Hey, I'm pitching this thing to the BBC. Do you want to come up with an idea?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then I ended up writing a short film for them. And although that was outside my comfort zone, you know, I'm not a natural scriptwriter, it's really nice to have done it. You know, it's nice to say that I've written for the BBC, and that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't met him 10 years ago. And so that's why I say yes to a lot of stuff.
This, that's something that has escaped my research. So tell us about this short film.
Yeah, so
Is it
it's
still
called Listen
available?
Dad. It's still available. So if you go to BBC iPlayer and look for Listen Dad, and it was really outside my comfort zone, Sam, because I'd never written for TV before. It was for CBBC, so it was for a young audience, which I've never written for, and it was a monologue, you know, which I've never written before. And so, you know, Faraz gave me a bit of a pep talk. He said, "Look, if you can put together a 90,000 word novel, you can do a 10-minute short film." But it was really hard, you know, it was really hard. And luckily, I had a great script editor, Chino. I had a great director, Hughes, and they kind of held my hand throughout the process. So the premise, you know, it's a monologue. It's a young girl. She's 13 or 14, and it was based on my own experiences of being a young language broker. And so by that I mean, you know, my parents didn't speak English, and
Yeah.
so even, you know, as a very young child, you know, I'm talking 6 or 7, I was translating for my parents. When I was a bit older, I was navigating really complicated systems like, you know, DWP, the Department of Work and Pensions, the NHS, you know, HMRC, because my parents didn't have any English. And that's a really difficult position to be in, because on one hand, you know, you feel proud of yourself because you're playing this adult role, but on another hand, you know, it's really difficult because you may not understand, you may not be able to negotiate these very adult conversations. And I remember doing research for the script and coming across a BBC article, and a young girl, I think she was maybe 9 or 10, was translating for her mum in the context of a hospital appointment, you know, and they said something about a cyst, and she didn't know what cyst meant, you know. And can you imagine just being 9 years old, trying to translate to your parents this serious medical condition and not knowing what, you know, and maybe you're not confident enough to ask the doctor, what does that mean? And so I just wanted to show the kind of loneliness that you can feel in that situation. But of course, because it was for CBBC, you know, you had to have kind of a bit of a positive bent to it as well. And so, yeah, it's this young girl in a hospital with her dad. She wants to get to her football game because a scout's going to be there. And so there are these two kind of worlds rubbing up against each other. And she's trying to explain to her dad, you know, listen, Dad, this is why I'm upset. But of course, he can't understand her. And that was the premise. And you know, it was a really fun process. I was allowed to go on set. Again, it was during the pandemic, so you know, everything was locked down.
Mm.
I had to, this was when I was living in Yorkshire, so I got to my hotel, and basically I just had to stay there for 3 days, and they would just send a car to pick me up and take me to set and bring me back, and I had to get room service, so I couldn't even go to the restaurant. But you know, it was a really fun experience to be on set and see how it's all put together, and yeah, it was just so interesting, and I was in awe of what these actors do. You know, like this girl, I think she was 14 years old, Naina, who plays the Fatima in the short film, and she was just brilliant. And I thought, wow, you know, it's a completely different skill, but I was really proud to have done it. And again, you know, it came from a 10-year-old conversation.
It's really interesting to hear you talking about that, because there's a really lovely thing in the book with Salma, who has almost like a citizen's advice for students in her lunch
Mm,
break, at break times. And there is a scene with a young boy having to explain a medical procedure to his mum. And in the end, Salma realises, actually, it's a step too far for this. I'll get one of the
mm,
teachers who speaks Urdu to ring and speak to mum. And it's kind of having that awareness for Salma that, and obviously this is where it comes from. If you were doing this, then you've got that awareness of, actually, sometimes it might be better if there is an adult who can do it. And there's not always going
Yeah.
to be. That's not always going to, it's not always going to happen. I have worked with children who have been the translator for the
Mm,
parents, and it's that moment of they're learning English and the parent doesn't speak English, but it's not their first language either. And
mm,
having that moment where you are trying to explain something to somebody who doesn't have a big grasp of English yet, and you're trying to give them something that they can explain, that does really come across well. And it's something that I've done, and I hadn't really thought about just how that child and the mum, how helpless the mum
mm,
must have felt in that moment as well. All these conversations going on around her, and she's relying on her child who um,
mm.
doesn't grasp the full language yet. And it's made me think of different things when I was reading it. You go back over your own memories and things that have happened. Yeah,
I
it's
think that's
something that
why
you
it's so.
tackled beautifully.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's so important to have diversity in fiction, and I'm not just talking about racial diversity, I'm talking about class diversity, disabilities, because there's such a richness of experience in the
Yeah.
world, and for such a long time literature was the preserve of a very narrow slice of society, and now what you're seeing is a bigger, wider breadth of voices. And that's where one of the proudest things as a writer is when people write to me and say, this is me, this is my life, you've captured it so well. And I remember somebody saying, I think it was with Take It Back, and it was a young Muslim woman saying, when you're reviewing this book, remember that you're reviewing our lives. And I was so touched by that, because that book in particular, divided opinion. There were some Muslim people who thought that the premise was too provocative, and a bit
Mm.
gimmicky. So, for those who don't know, Take It Back, the premise was four Muslim boys are accused of rape by a white girl, a 16-year-old white girl, and it follows the court case and the ways in which the different parties are treated. And, you know, I remember being at a literary festival and a Muslim girl saying, I'm not going to read this book, it makes me really angry. And I sought her out afterwards and said, look, can I please send you a copy of the novel, because it's really not, it's not kind of capitalizing, what she thought I was doing was capitalizing on my identity to kind of sell books. And I thought, no, the whole point of the novel is that we do things because we choose to do them as individuals, not because of the color of our skin. And
Yeah.
so that, there have been some people who've taken exception to my work, and that's fine. But when people write to me and say, stuff like, remember when you're reviewing this book, you're reviewing our lives, and that's when I think I'm doing my job as a novelist, and I'm doing it well. And that's why I always push for diversity, because there are so many stories that I'm yet to hear and
Yeah.
read and listen to. And there's so much beauty in the world that isn't coming to the fore because, as I said, there was a narrow slice of people who were being able to tell these stories. And I'm just glad that we've got people like S.A. Cosby now telling his story of, growing up in the South, and these amazing characters that we wouldn't know otherwise. And so it's improving, and I'm really pleased to see that.
And one thing I can say to anyone who hasn't picked up any of your books yet, based on the comment that the young lady made to you, is that there's nothing sensational about them. You have
Mm,
not used anything for shock value. There's nothing gimmicky about it. You could literally be reading about your neighbours in this one in
thank
particular.
you.
I think Take It Back might have been the first book of yours that I read. I mean, it's a while ago now, and I read two, one after the other, for an interview we were doing,
Mm-mm.
which was quite a while ago now. So I've not spoken to you online for quite some time. But
No,
yeah, that there's no sensationalism. You have not used anything for shock value. You have used
thank
shocking
you.
situations, but none of them are designed to just make the. You're not trying to outdo something. You're literally talking
Mm.
about how people react and how people live and how people treat each other. There's no kind of element of doing it for the sake of doing it with your books.
Thank you. And sometimes you do, coming back to what you said about choosing words carefully. I remember in Take It Back, one of the boys makes an anti-Semitic comment, and I thought about that really carefully. And I thought, do I want to
Mm.
include this in the novel? And I thought, well, the realistic thing is to include it because I've known boys like that, and I've known people who've been anti-Semitic and just said that as a off the cuff comment, And I did have somebody write to me and said, I wish you hadn't said that. And I thought, well, I'm really sorry if you felt targeted, in that situation. That's never my intention. My intention is to be as true as I can, and like another thing that I often say is, I was listening to a podcast with Constance Wu and Jamila Jamil, and she said something that really struck a chord. So she's in a show, I can't remember what the show, I think it's called Fresh Off the Boat, Constance Wu,
Yeah.
and in it she has an accent. And she said a lot of people took exception to the fact that she had an accent in that because you're playing into stereotypes. And she said, well, I know people who are older and have accents, like that's the most realistic thing. But because for so long other people have told our stories, now it's almost like we can't tell our own stories because
Yeah.
we've been stereotyped by the middle class white writer. And that's struck a chord so much because sometimes when we're talking about South Asian stories, we use arranged marriage as a shortcut to show that, oh, this is a very stereotyped story. But in Take It Back, Zara had an arranged marriage, and that was because I had an arranged marriage when I was 24, and it didn't last. But I had, and a lot of my Bengali friends had. So when I'm talking about Bengali women of my age, the most realistic thing is for them to have had an arranged marriage. But because that's been used so much in culture to show us as a shallow, one note society, it's almost like, oh, I can't use that anymore because I just need to tell positive stories. And I reject that so strongly. My job as a novelist is not to tell positive stories, it's to tell authentic, realistic stories that make people engage with those characters and think about the world in a new way. And so I just, I do get angry when people say, oh, you should be portraying us in a positive way. No, that's not my job.
Yeah, you're right. Your job is to show some authenticity, to show what genuinely happens in not just you, all writers they have an obligation in a way to tell their truth because there have been so many people writing stories that they didn't know enough about, and it's been portrayed maybe on television. Certain things have been portrayed in certain ways for a long time. People assume, and I know I've done it sometimes with, for example, forensics. We might assume that somebody does certain thing as part of their job, and then my friends who do forensics for a living, Kate Bendelow is a serving CSI, and it drives her mad when people wander in and pick things up with a pen or trample across. If there's clearly a body there and they are clearly dead, and you can tell because their head is not attached to their body, you're not going to trample the scene looking for a pulse. I
No,
mean, that's an
no.
extreme example, but we need that, yeah, the authenticity. You want to know that what you're seeing is actually how it is. And if we're all being educated through that, then surely that can only be a good thing. We can't just assume that
Absolutely.
20 years of the wrong thing being shown on TV and then suddenly somebody does it right. Surely that's growth. Surely that's progress. Surely that's a good education for people.
Yeah, and I've talked to people about this as well. And, I could have had, the girl who spoke to me at the literary festival, she said, well, she's a barrister, which is, Zara is an ex-barrister, which isn't a particularly typically thought of as being Muslim, and even her name is Zara, which isn't, couldn't, might not be a Muslim name, could be a white name. And I just thought, well, what are you saying, that Muslim people can't be barristers? Or that's playing into a trope in your own way. And so I do think, there's a lot of, sometimes there's extra pressure to represent, and I often say, well, I can't represent over a billion, nearly 2 billion people just because I'm one of the few Muslim writers out there. It's impossible. And so you have to tell the story that you want to tell and hope that you find an audience.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, isn't it? It's finding the audience and then having that audience spread the word of mouth. And you want to
Yeah.
resonate with people. You want people to pick it up and see elements of themselves and people that they know and things that are familiar to them. The whole
Yeah.
universal truth thing is for a reason. You want people to have an understanding of some elements of it and then look at other things and maybe question themselves and grow from things, maybe learn something about themselves through your words.
Yeah, I mean, for me, word of mouth has been incredible. That's really what's got my books out there.
Yeah,
In the kind of grand scheme, I'm a minnow compared to the kind of crime writing greats, but I am carving myself a readership, and I know my books get borrowed from libraries. I know my books get shared. I know my books start conversations, and that's really important for me as a
yeah,
writer. When I'm talking about deeper issues. I mean, look, you can pick up my novels and read them as a pure page turner. Like that's my first and foremost aim. No one wants to write a boring book, but yeah, there's always a deeper theme there to be engaged with.
yeah. You are a very entertaining writer, and you do want to turn the pages.
Thank
Daniel
you.
McBreakneck saying Kia's books are very powerful. We've got. I've realised we've got 10 minutes, and I've barely. I just keep. I've not looked at most of the questions that I made notes on. And I've barely looked at everybody else's, so I apologise. We
It's my
always really
fault.
get
I'm a
into
chatterbox. I'm sorry.
such deep conversations, me and you, when we talk. Sarah wants to know if you'll be going to Harrogate this year. So not just Harrogate, where else can people go and meet you and maybe get signed books and come
Yeah,
and
so
see you in
yeah,
person?
I'm at Crime Fest this year. I'm at Granite Noir. I'm at Harrogate. I'm at Chiltern Kills. I think everything's up on my site. So if you go to kiaabdullah.com events, you can see where I'll be this year.
Fantastic. Dan also wanted to say he loves your books. He's been reading them since Take It Back came out.
Thank
Um,
you.
Laura's saying she's read Truth Be Told, it was fab, clever plot. She needs to read more of your books. Yes, you do, Laura. You will absolutely
Thank
love them.
you.
Me and Laura have quite similar tastes in books. Sarah wants to know how you keep track of your characters, a whiteboard or a spreadsheet, or how do you go about it?
I have a spreadsheet, so I'll download pictures even of people or of kind of I'll have an idea of what they look like, and then I'll Google that characteristic to find a face that kind of matches the
Mm,
character. So in Google Docs, I'll know what they look like, their height, their eye color, and so on. Even their ticks, because sometimes when you write, you can kind of transpose ticks onto different characters. So one might, I don't know, pull out an earlobe, for example, but then suddenly you'll have somebody else do the same thing, pull out an earlobe. And so what I try to do is have specific ticks assigned to each character. So I'm not, so if somebody bites the lip, to use a cliche, it's that same character doing it throughout the book
yeah.
rather than different things, their likes, dislikes. One book for any aspiring writers out there is The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. And that really helped me think about characters in a different way. So he
Mm,
talks about something called the sacred flaw. What's the thing that happened to that person that makes them believe something about the world that may not be true? So, for example, maybe somebody had their heart broken and now they believe that me keeping everybody at arm's length will protect me, or you know to use a trope, the kind of drunken alcoholic detective who went through a divorce, he might see the world in a certain way. And so what is that character's sacred flaw? But to get beyond the kind of cliches, and that informs the way I build a character as well. What happened to them in their lives, what do they believe about the world that may not necessarily be true, but it informs the way they interact. And so I'll even have like a little row for sacred flaw. um, and yeah, that's the way I do it. And I also plot in Google Docs as well. I've tried other ways of plotting, but it's never really worked for me, and so I always go back to Google Docs.
I'm going to ask you, we've got just over 5 minutes left. Have you been watching anything that really stands out lately? That people might, sometimes you need to palette cleanse between books. It might be you go from a sequence to a cozy or something else, or it's class through, say, but I've been watching, I plowed through two series of Happy Valley before the new series started, and I've been watching that every Sunday. So I'm not going to talk about Happy Valley at all, because I know that there are people who will save the 6 episodes and watch them. But one of the things that made me kind of chuckle to myself is that James Norton, who plays Billy Royce, who is an interesting character, to say the least, for anyone who hasn't watched it. I kind of thought, imagine if I came face to face with him, it would be, for a moment, he's so good, he's so convincing, he's so terrifying. I think for a moment I might quite take him back and forget that he's an actor because he's so good. So and you can see me or not. Could you see me then, or did I disappear?
You did disappear. We caught most of it. I think you were glitching for a while. I know you were talking about Happy Valley and the guy in there who's
James
I haven't started
Norton, yeah.
watching. Yeah, I haven't started watching season three, but you are you talking about the villain who?
Tommy Lee Royce is the villain. He's
Yes, he's
fantastic.
brilliant.
And
He is brilliant. He's so chilling.
he really is. And Sarah Lancashire and Siobhan Finneran and Reese, I've got Reese's last name written down, Reese Connor, who plays Tommy's technically his son. I feel like Sarah Lancashire's character, Catherine Kaywood's going to appear from somewhere and tell me it's not his son. But so it's so gripping. The writing's terrific. It's funny, it's dark, it's scary, it is just wonderful. And I want to know what you would recommend to people.
Oh, okay. So I've just finished watching. My tastes are quite dark, but this was almost too dark for me. So the first season of Delhi Crime, which
Okay.
is kind of in two languages, so it's in Hindi and English, and it centers on the Delhi rape case of
Okay.
Jyoti, the girl who got gang raped on a moving bus.
Yeah.
It's very dark, but it's done really, really well. The main character in that is brilliant, a little bit like Sarah Lancashire, actually, just really tough, um, but very realistic. There are moments of vulnerability, and she's just very believable as a detective, and particularly a female detective. Um, I also enjoyed Dharma, following in the kind of really dark vein. I mean, some of it was just so I mean, it's very dark, but some of it was just very beautifully done. And there's one episode in particular, I think it's episode 5. It has a deaf character in it, and it's just done so beautifully, and it just haunted me for weeks after. So I recommend those. For lighter fare, if you haven't seen Dark on Netflix, it's a bit of a mind-bending sci-fi series, which is really good. And Yellow Jackets, which again is a little bit dark, but it's got elements of kind of comedy and horror. I think that's on Disney Plus, and it's about a football team of young girls who crash in the middle of. I think it's set in Canada, but I could be wrong. Um, it's somewhere in the wilderness, and they crash, and they have to spend, I think it's a year and a half in the wilderness, and awful things happen, but you don't know quite what. But that's highly recommended.
I think it might be on your Twitter that I saw Yellow Jackets recommended. I'm not
Yes,
sure.
so
I've
I
not watched
was,
it yet,
yeah,
but
I did a
I'm going
podcast
to
called
trust it.
Better Known, where they ask you to choose 6 things that should be better known. So I chose Yellow Jackets because
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think many people have been watching it. It's not, in the same way as some
I
series
hadn't
just
heard of
completely
it
blow
until
up.
you'd mentioned it.
Okay, then watch it. I definitely recommend it.
We have got 2 minutes left. So, how are you going to be spending publication day tomorrow for those people next door? Which is
So
terrific. I urge
tomorrow,
everybody to go and read it.
thank you. Yes, please do. So tomorrow I've got an event. So again, because my novels have a bit of a courtroom element to it, I'm doing an event at Middle Temple, which is one of the Inns of Courts, with 2 other brilliant writers, Imran Mahmood and Nadine Matheson, and then probably definitely going to go and have a drink.
Best of luck for tomorrow. I hope the
Thank
publication
you.
goes wonderfully well for you. And I hope you'll come back and talk to us when the next book's out. Do you want to give us a bit of
Absolutely.
a clue about? You said you're going to be working on one every other year now. So does that mean there'll be one released every other year? We've got to wait 2 years now for the next Kia Abdullah.
Yes, I'm afraid so. So yeah, so I'll be working on the new novel. It's not done in my head, so I won't say anything about it. But yeah, I'll. It's kind of all hands on deck this year, trying to get the next one done.
Well, thank you very much for coming to join us. Thank you to everybody who's watched and asked questions. I hope I've got to most of them. I think I just got caught in the moment with you of talking about this book. It really is terrific, and I
Thank
really
you,
wish
thank you,
you all the
Sam.
best with it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.